I want to share with you my work together with co-authors on competition among renewables. And let me start with something that certainly we all know about, but it's good not to forget that we have to be super ambitious because we have an enormous challenge ahead. We have to reduce emissions by a large amount. And the only thing that I want to point out here in this very knowledgeable room full of experts is that let's not forget that all these sectors have to be doing a great effort in reducing emissions, but certainly the power sector will bear a great responsibility in addressing emission reductions for itself, but also for the other sectors of the economy. So we know we have to get there. But it doesn't mean that we know the answers to all the questions. And many questions come to my mind. And let me just throw them out here. I know many of you are working on these issues, but I believe that the energy transition is very important. And for us researchers, it's also a great source of research questions that provide very interesting issues for us to look into. I'm really concerned as to whether investment incentives in renewables are really out there. We see that many investments in renewables are taking place nowadays, but it is important to understand how electricity markets will work and whether in the future, as we keep on investment in renewables, the prices provided by that market will provide the right investment incentives that we need for those investments in renewables to take place and allow us to go down the road of emissions reductions. It's very important to understand whether the regulatory incentives out there allow for the right technologies to be chosen and whether these will all be done at least cost for consumers. The issue is that I think we don't really know exactly how 100% renewables markets work, and answering this question is very important in order to understand the first issue that I raised, that is whether there is investment incentives out there, or whether we should redesign electricity markets in ways that make them perform well, but also provide those investment incentives. It's very important to understand what are the incentives provided by the way we pay for renewables, and it's equally important to understand whether there's the correct market structure and the correct regulatory provisions to induce the optimal operation of storage facilities and the optimal incentives to invest in storage facilities. We often also rely on demand response as a way to provide balancing in this market, but the issue is that I'm not really sure we fully understand whether or the extent by which demand response will be able to truly contribute to balancing as much as we are expecting it to do so. There's a long list of questions, and I'm sure many of you can keep on adding questions to the list. I believe these are all first-order questions to which we economists could provide relevant answers. This is what I've been trying to do in my work, certainly now with my ERC on the energy transition. Together with co-authors, we are trying to start providing some of the answers to these questions. Today I'm going to be talking about two papers. One of them is finished, the other one is work in progress, and in different ways from different angles, both try to deal with how do renewables compete in this market and how does this depend on market design. So the first paper that I'm going to present today, at least just a brief overview of it, tries to understand how will 100% renewables market work, always from a very stylized IO perspective. So you will see there's many details that are not going to be in there, but we believe some of the relevant stylized facts of the markets will be captured by this model. The other paper we're working on, which is mostly an empirical paper, tries to understand how different schemes, different pricing schemes for renewables affect the way renewables behave in the electricity markets and the incentives induced to other players in the electricity market. So disregarding the effects of, say, feed-in tariffs or feed-in premium on investment incentives, we take existing capacities as given and we try to understand how do generators behave. Do they behave differently when they are subject to, say, feed-in tariffs or feed-in premium? I'm not going to be talking about all the work in progress that we are working on. together with Juan Pablo Montero, we are looking into auctions for renewables. This is also another setup in which renewables certainly compete, but they compete for investment, whereas today I'm just going to be looking at competition within the energy market. I'm also working with a current PhD student of the EUI on storage and the relevance of market structure. And together with some colleagues in the US, David Rapson and Marwe Want, we are trying to quantify the response of households to real-time pricing. As in Spain, we have real-time pricing implemented by default for all customers since 4 years ago. Let me start with the paper that I was mentioning at the beginning, auctions with unknown capacity, trying to understand competition among renewables. In this paper, we focus on the competitive effects of renewables as compared to other technologies. And from this point of view, regardless of the many differences across renewables versus conventional technologies, we mainly focus on their differences related to competition. And here, I want to stress something which is very important, and certainly so from a modeling perspective, which is the fact that whereas conventional plants we can think of maybe as their cost being asymmetric information, but the capacity is very known, the difference with renewables is that we know their marginal costs, so there's no incomplete cost information. Their marginal costs are essentially zero and quite homogeneous across producers, whereas their available capacities are not, because these available capacities are subject to random shocks that are related to weather conditions, some of which are local. So our point in this paper is showing that renewables have many impacts in the market, but they will also change the nature of competition among electricity producers, and we want to understand how. This is just a figure that some of you might already know. It's difficult to forecast wind production, so even if there's great statisticians providing forecasting models to try to forecast wind production, some forecast errors remain. This is data from the Spanish system operator, but this is true across countries. So the fact that it's difficult to forecast wind is coupled with the fact that individual producers, they have private information on their own production. And this private information comes from their own, say, metering stations that they have at the local sites that provide them with better information that allows them to better forecast their own production as compared to what others can do with only publicly available information. So what we did, we performed these forecast models trying to compare how can I forecast the production of one plant if I only have public information versus how do I forecast my own production with my own private information. And certainly, it shouldn't come as a surprise. I do a better job when I have private information because this private information is out there, and this might affect the way I bid. So we built up this model in which essentially we have two firms which are ex-ante symmetric. Their available capacities are subject to some common shocks that are common across participants, but each of them is also subject to an idiosyncratic component that is private information. Demand for electricity in this market is price inelastic. There's a price cap denoted by capital P, and to make things simple, we assume that the demand is known at the time of bidding. This market works as most electricity markets in practice. It's a uniform price auction, and we assume that renewables are paid at market prices. You can think of these as renewables being subject to feed-in premium. Given this setup, we characterize the Bayesian as equilibria to try to understand, given the private information that players receive in the market, how they're going to bid and how is this going to translate into equilibrium market outcomes. And essentially, to make things simple and go straight to the result, this is the bidding function that we find. What this figure is telling us is that given my realized capacity, let's say that given my private information, I know that 70% of my windmill is going to be available. This is telling me, okay, then you should submit this price. You should offer this quantity at this price. What this means, the fact that this bidding function is decreasing, is that the more available capacity I have, the lower is the price at which I'm willing to offer my capacity, because I have so much capacity that I really want to make sure that this capacity is going to be dispatched, it's going to win this auction. In this figure, the price cap is equal to 0.5 and marginal cost is equal to 0. What does it mean? It means that even though we have 0 marginal cost, because we are strategic players, we are always bidding a markup on top of my marginal cost. And when I'm really small, I have a little available capacity at a moment of time, I'm even willing to bid at the price cap. Why? Because if I have a small capacity, I'm likely going to be the price setter, and I want to set a high price for all the output in this market. So essentially what this is telling us is that the more available capacity there is, the more windy this hour of the day is, the lower the bids of the players, leading to low prices. The less windy the hour is, the higher the bids, the higher the prices, and we can get situations in which even if we just have competition among renewables, price caps and therefore market power can be substantial. We even find cases in which firms find it optimal to compete by withholding their output, not just by raising price above marginal cost, but also by throwing away their wind, essentially not making use of it so as not to depress market prices. Okay? So sometimes we can find capacity withholding. This implies, as I was telling before, that we can have different situations. So what these figures are showing here is the aggregate supply function in the market. So because we have two players with different capacity realizations, they will be offering different prices. And the higher their capacity realizations, the lower are the bids at which they're willing to offer their capacity. So at times when there's a lot of wind availability, the aggregate supply function in the market is going to be not only lower, but it's also going to be shifting downwards because they are willing to offer lower prices and more quantities at those lower prices. This is going to give rise to markups and also to price volatility. In a way, I also wanted to stress that clearly renewables is a zero marginal cost of production in this market, which tends to depress prices. But market power is going to mitigate the price depressing effect of renewables in markets in which renewables are subject to feed-in tariffs. What happens as we install more capacity in the market? So far I was just discussing the effects of, for given existing assets, what happens in more windy days. Now the exercise that I'm performing out of this equilibrium is a comparative statics, trying to understand what happens when we increase investment. When we increase investments, the bidding functions shift out, meaning that for a given capacity realization, firms are willing to charge higher prices. They're willing to charge higher prices because for a given capacity realization, I'm more likely to be the small player, and therefore I'm more likely to be concerned more about increasing the market price rather than about increasing my market share. But overall, because there's more capacity, despite the fact that they are offering higher prices, there is a smooth reduction in expected market prices. So as we increase investment in renewables, prices go down smoothly, and only in the extreme case in which there's excess renewable capacity, if you want, only in that case the market becomes perfectly competitive with prices equal to marginal cost. Otherwise, if we don't get down the road of this excess investment, we are going to still have prices above marginal cost, and therefore inefficiencies related to market power. So if we stick to a system based off feed-in premia or exposing renewables to energy market prices, we are going to have market power, price dispersion. We might even get capacity withholding, and even though it is true that investments will push prices down, they will only push them down smoothly. So the question is, can we avoid these market distortions through market design? How would competition among renewables perform if we relied on alternative pricing schemes? This is an issue that we can analyze from a theoretical perspective, and we could also try to analyze it from an empirical perspective using the data that is already out there, given the experiments, let's call it that way, the regulatory experiments that several countries across Europe, unfortunately, have been running because they've been changing the pricing schemes that renewables have been subject to. At least for researchers, that provides us with natural experiments that we can try to exploit to understand the impact of pricing schemes on their bidding incentives. So paying for renewables with different instruments certainly affects the way they compete, but they might also have an impact on how these conglomerate players that own both renewables as well as conventional technologies participate in this market. So they affect bidding behavior by renewables, as we just saw, but they also affect bidding behavior by conventional technologies, and therefore they have a broad impact on overall market performance. As many of you in this room know, there's essentially, we can classify the instruments or the pricing schemes for renewables in 3 broad categories. One of them is feed-in tariffs. Essentially, we pay producers a fixed price per unit of renewable output. That is, they are not exposed to the energy market prices, rather they get paid according to prices that have been set ex ante, either by a regulatory decision or by competition through capacity auctions. We can also resort to feed-in premia. Essentially, we would be exposing producers with the volatility in market prices, and on top of that, we can pay them a fixed period that has been set ex ante. Or we can face producers with contract for differences, which would be a kind of hybrid between these 2 instruments, in that they receive the market price, but any difference between the strike price of this contract and the market price is settled by differences, just as if it was a financial contract. The debate as to which of these pricing schemes should be used has mainly focused on the impact that they have on investment incentives, certainly because, for instance, feed-in premia reflect the market value of renewables on the one hand, but on the other hand, they expose producers with excessive price volatility, therefore increasing the cost of capital that these investors have to pay. Rather than focusing on the impact of pricing schemes on investment, what we want to do in this research project is try to understand whether, once the assets are in place, whether facing producers with these different pricing schemes affects the way they behave in the energy markets, therefore affecting overall market outcomes. And in order to do so, we combine both a theoretical and empirical analysis with a counterfactual analysis. In the theoretical analysis, we try to understand the incentives provided by this alternative pricing rule, and we take the theoretical predictions to the data using the regulatory experiments that took place in Spain. In 2013, by surprise, the regulator moved all wind producers from a feed-in premium scheme to a feed-in tariff scheme, and then in 2014, all producers went back to a feed-in premium scheme. So these back and forth of regulatory changes allow us, hopefully, to cleanly identify the effects that these pricing schemes have on bidding behavior. Because everything is not out there, we want to understand how market structure, the ownership structure of renewables affects bidding incentives. We also run, or our plan is to run, a counterfactual analysis to try to measure how market structure affects the relative performance of these pricing schemes. And to give you a hint of what we are currently looking at, let me tell you some of our theoretical results, theoretical predictions that we then take to the data. We start from a paper by Kohiro Ito and Marwe Want in American Economic Review. Essentially, they say we can think of electricity markets as markets organized as sequential markets. There's a large day-ahead market, and there's real-time markets. Dominant producers exercise market power by bidding their units above marginal cost, but they also exploit opportunities to price discriminate across these 2 markets. Essentially, what they do is they withhold output in the day-ahead market to increase prices in that market in which they sell the large fraction of their sales. And then whatever they have not sold in the wholesale market, then they sell it again in the real-time market. In that way, they open up a price gap between the day-ahead market price, which is higher than the spot market price. The fringe producers understand that this is the case, so they try to arbitrage price differences across these two sequential markets. How do they do it? Well, mainly wind producers, because typically they don't have enough wind to operate at full capacity. What they do is that they offer all of their capacity in the day-ahead market to sell it at very high prices, and then they buy back whatever they cannot produce in the spot market at a much lower price. So somehow, by doing this overselling in the day-ahead market, the fringe producers mitigate the market power that dominant producers have in the day-ahead market, because as they try to withhold output to increase prices in the day ahead, part of this is mitigated by the increased supply of the fringe producers. They do not look into pricing schemes. They don't focus on renewables. They just talk about market performance in general. So what we do is we add renewables into this picture, and we try to understand the different impacts that different pricing rules have. Our first result regards feed-in tariffs. So recall that feed-in tariffs essentially pay producers a fixed price regardless of when or where they sell their output. When this is the case, the dominant producers have weaker incentives to exercise market power. Why? Because when they try to increase the energy market price, they might benefit out of their conventional technologies because they get to sell their conventional output at a higher price, but the price at which they sell their renewable output remains fixed, and therefore they do not benefit as much from the exercise of market power. So in this sense, feed-in tariffs mitigate the market power of dominant producers, and this effect tends to be stronger in windy days, which is precisely the days in which they have more renewable output. Instead, what happens with feed-in tariffs is that fringe producers, essentially, they have no incentives to arbitrage price differences across these sequential markets because they get the same price regardless of where they sell their output. So, on a way, feed-in tariffs are good because they mitigate the market power of the dominant producers. On the other hand, they are bad because they also mitigate the arbitrage incentives of the fringe players. In contrast, feed-in premia have the opposite effects. They give fringe producers incentives to arbitrage price differences, and through that they mitigate the market power of the dominant producers. But the dominant producers, they have a strong incentives to exercise market power in the first place, because they know that as they increase the market price in the day-ahead market, this is also going to increase payments to renewables. What we find theoretically is that this effect is weaker in windy days. Why? Because in windy days, the fringe producers, they have less limited ability to arbitrage price differences because they don't have this excess capacity, this idle capacity, which they can oversell in the day-ahead market. Essentially, this theory model, or the theory model that allows me to have these conclusions here, provide with some empirical predictions that we take to the Spanish bidding data, which is very, very much detailed. So what I brought here was the following picture to try and help you, to try and convince you that this is actually an experiment. So what you have here in this figure is the time series of the average bids that were submitted on a daily basis by the fringe producers in light gray and the dominant producers in dark black out of their renewable assets. Okay? February 1st, 2013 was the day when this royal decree was approved that essentially moved all the wind producers from a feed-in premium system to a feed-in tariff system. And as you can see, whereas before that date, essentially the renewable producers, they were bidding some positive prices, there was some action there, probably also indicating that not only they were active in the day-ahead market, but also they were also active arbitraging price differences across the sequential markets. All of a sudden, they started bidding at zero. First, because the feed-in tariff system obliged them to bid at zero, but even if they had not been obliged, they would probably also have decided optimally to bid at zero, because essentially the price they get in this market is completely inconsequential, but because they would be paid the feed-in tariff anyway. The new regulation is somehow approved by mid-2013, but it is not fully detailed until June 2014, and right when the new regulation, all these regulatory parameters that would be used to compute the feed-in premium for the renewables, the dominant producers, they are back on the road bidding positive prices, and the fringe producers decided to start bidding up somehow before that date at a time when it was a very windy winter, so they didn't want to run the risk of bidding too low and get it dispatched at prices that would not even cover their variable cost. So essentially, we are using what we believe is a very nice natural experiment to try to understand the impact of changes in the pricing rules for renewables on bidding behavior, and this is something that we are currently doing. This is a bit more the detail of the bids. The previous ones were the average bids. These are the actual bids at the plant level for the fringe, and these are the actual bids for the dominant players. Let me just show you this figure if I have the time. Great, thank you, Simone. So in this figure, what we try to show is this arbitrage strategy by fringe producers. Let me try to explain what this is representing. Zero means that there's no difference between what I sell in the day-ahead market and my final commitment at the end of all the sequence of markets. So whenever we see these positive numbers, it means that these producers were selling more in the day-ahead market than what they ended up selling at the end of this sequence. So if they were overselling in the day-ahead market, it means that they were buying back their excess production in the, say, intraday markets. The red dots represent the strategy of the fringe players, and the blue dots represent the strategy of the dominant players. If we see that that is negative, what these firms were doing, they were withholding output in the day-ahead market and selling more in the other markets, because being negative essentially means that in the day-ahead market, I sold less than what I ended up producing. So what do we see? We see that while feed-in premia were in place, the fringe producers were doing this arbitrage. They were overselling to benefit from the fact that the dominant producers were raising prices in the day-ahead market. But as soon as the feed-in tariff was in place, essentially they stopped doing this arbitrage. They would not oversell anymore because it was not in their interest to do so, but because they were not overselling, they were not engaging in arbitrage. Essentially, the dominant producers were more free to keep on withholding, because that would not be mitigated by the arbitrage behavior of the fringe producers. And then in 2014, when we essentially moved back again to the feed-in premium system, they would go back to arbitrage again. So certainly we believe this provides evidence, which is yet preliminary at this stage of our research, that when we remove the price risk from the producers, essentially they become more passive. They do not engage in arbitrage, but they might also reduce the incentives of the dominant producers to exercise market power in the first place. So the way we try to capture this effect empirically is through a structural bidding equation. We leverage on the profit maximization in the day-ahead market and conclude that with feed-in tariffs, firms should not internalize the effect of prices on wind, mitigating their market power. We measure the arbitrage effect with a diff-in-diff strategy. So essentially what we find is that once the feed-in tariff is in place, if they oversell, that is uncorrelated with the price premium across markets. So whatever overselling that we might see must be for reasons other than the price differences. And at the end of the day, we find that we have these two effects that work in opposite directions. The forward contract effect mitigates market power under feed-in tariffs, whereas the arbitrage effect mitigates market power under feed-in premium. We want to understand which of the two effects dominates on the impact on market power. So we want to understand what is the evolution, what was the evolution of markups in these markets, either measured directly or indirectly, to try to understand which of these two effects dominated. So we have a lot of work ahead of us. But we believe this is a nice setting in order to shed light on what we believe is certainly a very important issue, how we pay for renewables. This is something that is going to affect investment incentives, and this is something that we are dealing with in another paper. But beyond investment incentives, they also affect the way the electricity market performs. We might have this market power mitigating effect or this other market power mitigating effect through arbitrage, and we need to understand which of these two forces is the most dominant one. Our current conclusions is that this very much depends on market power. If the renewable sector is highly fragmented, so we have many renewable owners, it's likely that the arbitrage effect is going to be more important. However, if it seems to be the case nowadays that most of the renewable investments, so a great part of them, are being undertaken by the dominant producers, and this increases concentration in the renewable sector, then we might be worried about the market power these firms might have, and therefore we might put more weight on the market power mitigating effect of feed-in tariffs as compared to feed-in premia. There's lots of work ahead, but we are very excited about this project, and hopefully we'll be able to present you the final results in another conference or in another summer school that Simone will kindly organize in the future. Thank you so much.